All right, guys. So this lecture is going to be a little bit on the quicker side. Just wrapping up our section on 19th century protest movements with specifics to the abolitionist movement. I want to talk about the overall impacts of the movement. So we're going to continue to talk about this when we get into our unit on the Civil War. So this is kind of a preview of how abolitionism really divides the nation over this issue of slavery, which is going to be the major issue that leads to the Civil War. So kind of to start us off in thinking about the impacts of the movement, we have to acknowledge the divisions that it creates within the country. So those divisions are national in a lot of ways, where we have pro-slavery supporters versus those supporters of abolition. It's important to remember that most pro-slavery supporters were in the South, but they weren't all in the South. So there are pro-slavery supporters in the North as well. So we know from our discussion today in class that one of the tactics the South used to combat abolition was that they promoted slavery as a moral system. Slavery is a good thing. Slaves need benevolent slaveholders in order to survive in the American system. They wouldn't survive otherwise. They would bring the system down if they were granted freedom. They also criticized the Northern factory system. Sure, Northern states had outlawed slavery, but they still permitted the use of immigrant labor in these factory systems. And people like George Fitzhugh, who defended slavery, said slaves are actually treated better than immigrants who are earning wages in these factory systems. So that argument really started to solidify in the 1840s as a reaction to slavery and helped Southerners to cling more kind of vehemently to the slave system in the South. It's also important that as the abolitionists became more outspoken and organized in the North, pro-slavery supporters began to kind of come out of the woodwork and threaten abolitionists. Violence in Philadelphia in 1834 at the abolitionist headquarters called the Temple of Liberty resulted in that place being burned to the ground and a race riot ensuing. A mob seized William Lloyd Garrison in Boston and threatened to hang him in 1835. So we're starting to see, as the abolitionist stance solidifies, so does the pro-slavery stance. And you can start to see conflict and division between these two groups. In addition to the pro versus abolitionist division, we also start to see division develop within the abolitionist group. So to start kind of looking at that division, there's a few different things that are happening here. But first of all, William Lloyd Garrison leads a really radical branch of abolitionists. He condemns the U.S. Constitution as a, quote, covenant with death and an agreement with hell. He attacks churches in the North as being kind of sanctuaries for pro-slavery thought. And he does this really radical thing, which he proposes that women should participate in this movement in terms of full equality with men. So he's saying if we are advocating for the rights of slaves as people, then we should also recognize the rights of women with full equality. Garrison argued that women have always been central to the abolitionist cause. Remember, about 50 to 80% of petitions organized by abolitionists were organized by women. They promoted the abolitionist cause through speaking and writing, and this is something that causes his anti-slavery society to actually fracture and split in two. The two kind of approaches that we see within the northern groups that were anti-slavery are kind of the anti-slavery platform versus the abolitionist platform. And those two things aren't necessarily the same thing. Anti-slavery platforms like the Free Soil Party did not seek an immediate end to slavery everywhere and did not pressure the federal government to step in and force states to end slavery. Instead, the Free Soil Party and the anti-slavery movement promoted a gradual end to slavery, and particularly the Free Soil Party was against the expansion of slavery into any new territory. So they weren't going to attack slavery where it already existed. They weren't going to attack the southern states' rights to support slavery, but they were going to try to stop it from spreading any further. And on the other hand, people like William Lloyd Garrison thought that the Free Soil Party was despicable, that you can't take a moderate stance on abolition. And so, again, the abolitionist movement actually fractures in this way. And while Garrison criticized the Free Soil Party, in fact, the Free Soilers did something that the abolitionists couldn't do, and that's they gained mainstream support for stopping the expansion of slavery. The abolitionist movement remained kind of a minority fringe movement. The Free Soil Party actually links up with the Republican Party in 1852. And so it gains mainstream support from Northerners. Abraham Lincoln was a Free Soiler himself, whereas the abolitionist platform didn't gain that mainstream support that we see. So one of the impacts is that it causes these deep divisions in the nation. A second impact of abolitionism in the mid-19th century is that it reveals the reluctancy of the federal government to step in on behalf of slaves. So we already talked about the gag rule in the House of Representatives, right? This is that precedent that was passed that petitions to prohibit slavery in places like Washington, D.C. and free northern states was not allowed to be spoken about on the House of Representative floor. It brought up too many conflicts, too many opposing passionate feelings, and so they essentially squashed any conversation about, upholding fugitive slave laws in the North or prohibiting slavery in the South and anywhere else. We also see the federal government continue to compromise with slavery throughout the 19th century. We're going to come back to this when we talk about the Civil War, but one of the compromises that we see early on is something called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Senator Henry Clay was the architect of this compromise, and essentially what this compromise does, and I'll show you an image in a second, is it draws a line horizontally through the country. That line is known as the Mason-Dixon line. That line was devised to divide northern freed territory and states from southern slave states and territory. It also set a precedent for how states would be added to the Union. Slavery was prohibited above the Mason-Dixon line, with the exception of the state of Missouri, but it was allowed below the line. So any new states or territories that came in north of the Mason-Dixon line would come into the Union as free states, and any territory or states that came in south of the Mason-Dixon line would be slave states. And of course, the exception is Missouri, which is north of the Mason-Dixon line. So I'll show you that really quickly here. So you can see the Mason-Dixon line here, that dotted line, Arkansas Territory below. All the red states are slave states, including Missouri, which is yellow on this sheet. But you see all this unorganized Louisiana Purchase territory would enter into the Union as free. You also see Maine here at the tip of New England. Maine entered into the Union under this compromise as a free state. And this is done to balance the power, right, between slave states and free states. So Missouri came in as a slave state, Maine came in as a free state. Okay, this was devised as a way to kind of cool tensions between Northern and Southerners, but of course, abolitionists saw this as yet another evil compromise or covenant with an evil slave system. In addition to that, in 1850, the federal government strengthens the fugitive slave law that has been in existence since the 1790s. This is a part of another compromise in 1850 that basically said federal officials in northern states had the power to return fugitive slaves to their owners without due process of law. This meant that Southerners could actually come into northern states and claim their slaves by word only. So they didn't need any proof other than their word to actually have these slaves to bring back into slavery. This obviously caused a ton of issues in the North. Abolitionists were outraged by this, and it resulted in really kind of the wrongful enslavement of free blacks in the North in some cases. But we're seeing here the federal government unwilling to take the stance that abolitionists are pushing for. They're unwilling to force the prohibition of slavery, and instead they make compromises with the slave system. Another important event in the 1850s is the Dred Scott decision, so I'll tell you this story really quickly. Dred Scott was a Missouri slave who was once owned by an army surgeon. This army surgeon took Dred Scott with him to Illinois and Wisconsin, which, by the Missouri Compromise rules, were slave-free territories, so these were free places. When Scott's master died in 1846, Dred Scott sued his master's mistress for freedom. He claimed that his residence in free territories had liberated him from slavery. Obviously, this mistress was not going to take this. She brought Dred Scott to court. A state circuit court heard the case and actually sided with Dred Scott. They granted him his freedom. The family of Scott's mistress appealed this decision to the state Supreme Court, who overturned the verdict. So the state Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was not free. Scott and his lawyer appealed to a federal court, and eventually the Supreme Court heard the case in 1857. The Supreme Court upheld the ruling that Dred Scott was still a slave. This was a stunning legal defeat for abolitionism. However, the ruling here did help garner support for the abolitionist cause in the North. It made people in the North so furious that slaves were considered the property of their owners, even in territories that were ruled as free, that it actually turned some Northerners abolitionist and definitely garnered support for the free soil or abolitionist cause in the North. As you can imagine, Southern states were thrilled, because what this ruling actually does is repeal the Missouri Compromise. If Dred Scott could be labeled as still a slave after living in the Illinois and Wisconsin territory, which is up here in the unorganized Louisiana Purchase territory, well, then the Missouri Compromise actually doesn't exist anymore. And that's part of the Supreme Court ruling, that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. And we'll talk more in class tomorrow about the court's basis for that ruling. Here's a picture of Roger B. Taney, who delivered the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case, and a picture here, a portrait of Dred Scott, who is the enslaved person who sued for his freedom. Okay, so what we take away from this 19th century protest movement is that it really did, as our video suggested, fractured the nation further. We've talked about slavery as a sleeping serpent, always there under the table, but the momentum of the abolitionist and free soil party and movement really created larger fractures, larger divisions. And what we're going to see is that the 40s and 50s tell a story of a nation that is descending rapidly into conflict. By the presidential election of 1860, where Abraham Lincoln is elected president of the United States, the nation's divisions can't be mended. And the Civil War is imminent. It's definitely going to happen. And abolitionism, in part, brings to the surface this issue of slavery. And that is the cause of the Civil War and divides the nation. And so when we think about the abolitionist movement, right, as a protest movement, right, an injustice, fighting against an injustice to change the status quo, that injustice is the institution of slavery, and the status quo is the nation's acceptance of that institution. All right, guys, I'll see you tomorrow.